Keqing has been a staple in Genshin Impact ever since Dendro's introduction to the game, and with her being a standard banner 5-star, she's a lot more accessible for a multitude of players. You can find her nowadays in a lot of Dendro-centric team compositions. In this video, we're going to take a look at Keqing's rise, from rags to riches. In the early days of Genshin Impact, many players were still getting adjusted to the feel of an open world game with its combat centered around elemental reactions. Now, while this was unique and a major selling point of the game, a lot of players at the time just enjoyed using whoever, whenever, and this represented a much more simpler time during the game's lifespan. While others were still figuring out the nuances of the elemental reactions and raging from the horrendous Genshin system at the time, many others were just enjoying the view of their purple-haired cat girl, or fake cat girl. I'd be kidding if I didn't mention this amounted to some discourse in the community, but don't worry, this is a decent part of Keqing's backstory that we will cover later in the video. Genshin Impact, as with any other gacha game, a lot of the time spent in the early game was actually for repeatedly creating new accounts to obtain the player's desired character of choice, and this would later be known as rerolling. This will also be discussed later in the video, but for anyone fortunate, due to the nature of the gacha system and how hard it was to obtain specific characters at the time, you were met with an amazing electro damage dealer for the early game. When I say amazing, many players consider Keqing to be top tier alongside Diluc, because the other game for Genshin Impact amongst the players didn't actually have the elemental reactions you know and love today in mind. What made Keqing so powerful for the early game was her spammable ultimate that had a lot of range, gave the character a whopping 15% critical rate boost, and an increase in energy regeneration. Keqing's ultimate cost was 40, and couple this with the energy regeneration she gained from her previous ultimate, she could always have her ultimate ready to go off cooldown. This made her very good in a meta where players couldn't invest into artifacts to perfect their builds. Keqing had an elemental skill that would throw her hairpin in any direction she chose. I guess this confirms her being a fake cat girl. And after casting the elemental skill again, she would then gap close to the hairpin location, dealing damage and infusing her blade with electro for 6 seconds. This time window would allow her to be in a group known as main DPS, or nowadays on-field damage dealer. This would also prove to be amazing for exploration, because like Venti, having a traversing ability tied to a skill would make this character a staple in your teams when you needed to roam the open world of the game. Being able to reach animalculas that were unreachable allowed players to ignore some tedious puzzles altogether. And I remember always using Keqing to aid me in my Dragon Spine journey, because with a map centered around mostly climbing, you can see why her hairpin was always handy. With being amazing in the early game combat and the exploration, Keqing felt untouchable, and with her being the only electro main DPS at the time, it makes a lot of sense. She had no competition. Fischl? She wasn't on field as long as Keqing unless you had a physical oriented build. Lisa? She wasn't on field unless holding her elemental skill until the second charge, but she did 0 damage during that time frame. Keqing had 0 competition, or so we thought. Keqing, while having amazing synergy with Venti from exploration to combat thanks to the fact that her ultimate and elemental skill could deal a lot of AoE damage and actually reach the enemies that Venti would group with his ultimate, she would still fall victim to one thing: time. Over time, players would find the best ways to abuse the elemental reactions in the game. Pyro could combine with Hydro to create Vaporize, which resulted in a massive damage increase, and Ice could combine with Hydro to create the Freeze effect, which would keep enemies in place and negate any damage that you would take. Electro could combine with Hydro, and that would create the Electro Charged effect, which in comparison to the strong elemental reactions at the time would make it feel bleak. As for the rest of the Electro interactions, combining Electro and Pyro would create the Overload effect, and that would result in a small amount of extra damage, but also knock back the enemies, punishing Keqing's DPS window. The only electro interaction at the time that benefited Keqing was the combination of Ice, which would create the superconduct effect, lowering the enemy's physical resistance, and I kid you not, this was a huge boost of DPS for Keqing in the early game because she had the highest multipliers for charge attacks bar none. This newfound elemental interaction would form what was known at the time as the physical Keqing debate, and others like Fischl would follow suit also. Even though Keqing could infuse her elemental skill with electro, players would still find more value with having Keqing as a physical damage dealer. Slap on a physical damage bonus goblet and give Keqing a good weapon such as Harbinger of Dawn or Aqua Favonia if you are fortunate enough. You then had yourself a surprisingly viable version of Keqing. Nowadays this is a meme build, but at the time when artifact quality across the board was lacking and players were too fixated on the popular elemental reactions, you could see why. Something such as physical Keqing was passable as the most viable version of the character. With the ongoing threat of characters like Diluc continuing to become more and more popular, keqing would slowly start to see less play in the endgame content and events that required characters that were stronger and thought out teams for faster clears. With all of this in mind, miHoYo would do something very wise on their part to capitalize on the popularity of keqing, and this for the most of you will be a blast to the past. Nearly 3 years ago at the time of this video, patch 1.3 would officially drop, and this would bring the first in-game festival that Genshin Impact would ever celebrate with its players. Lantern Riot, which was centered around Chinese New Year, was a big festival held in Liyue, around, well, you guessed it, the start of the Chinese New Year. For Genshin's first major event, this was a massive touch on the cultural appropriation of the region, and to keep things in tradition, there would only be Liyue originated character banners. Despite being launched characters in Genshin Impact, keqing and Qiqi both originated in Liyue, but only keqing would be the one to have a raid-up banner during the patch. Zhao, another Liyue originated character, would be in the first half of the patch, and keqing would follow suit in the second half of her own banner. The reveal for a standard banner character taking the place of a limited banner character would take the whole community by surprise, as this meant a multitude of things. Any keqing oneer could become a keqing haver, and anyone that had keqing could either roll for more copies or continue saving for the next character. But considering how utterly garbage the constellations for keqing were, you knew exactly what decision the average keqing haver made. Being the only Electro 5-star at the time would allow miHoYo to capitalize on this one-time opportunity, becoming what is known as the worst performing banner of all time. But Genshin Impact, which has a yearly development cost of 100 million, this was ultimately the first and only L miHoYo would ever take. After this disaster of event, miHoYo would practically disown keqing as it felt entirely, and aside from her raid-up limited weapon alongside her banner at the time, Promoto J Cutter, she would never receive a buff or pseudo buff from the company, as they had a no buff policy in place to promote and sell future characters. After 1.3 and the constant release of the Liyue powerhouses and the fixed misconceptions of Ganyu being a main damage dealer and not supportive character, keqing would fall lower and lower in usage across all players' accounts into what would be known as irrelevancy. And it got so bad to the point that keqing would be the character often slandered and mocked by the community. The devoted keqing mains would continue to use her despite having a character fall victim to endless power creep, and the keqing regretters would drop the character altogether, adventure for what felt like an eternity. Funnily enough, those devoted keqing mains would contribute to a popular theory crafting group known as keqing mains, and this in itself would create tribalism with other characters in other groups. This is why there is a devoted group for every character in the game nowadays. I told you, this would be a blast to the past after all. As time went on, despite players having keqing with amazing investments and proper critical stats thanks to the massive critical rate boost the Primordial Jade Cutter provided alongside the critical rate boost that was provided for her ultimate, this would all prove to not be enough for her to keep up, and the cracks would begin to show. keqing had trouble dishing out damage for long periods of time, because she either staggered enemies with her charge attack or ran out of stamina, completely leaving her vulnerable and unable to dodge. keqing, despite having the highest charge attack multiplier, she couldn't compete against characters like Zhao, Hu Tao, and Ganyu, whom had dished out higher tiers of damage with their respective attacks. And if we're comparing ultimates, despite keqing having the lowest cost ultimate, she had lower multipliers. Unlike Hu Tao, she couldn't vaporize to increase her overall ultimate damage. Unlike Ganyu, she had no off-field capabilities with her ultimate. And unlike Zhao, she didn't have an ultimate that enhanced her main source of DPS. Compared to the Liyue trio, keqing was pretty underwhelming, and compared to Diluc, who also fell victim to the effects of power creep, he could at least still hold his own in his respective team compositions for Vaporize. And as for keqing, she had no best team composition. That's why you would see a variety of different keqing teams such as Taser, Physical, and Quick Swap. Players that wanted to use her would literally have to brute force their way through contents. As time went on, more players would continue to complain about the shortcomings of keqing, and ask for direct buffs to the character, but Hoyoverse, being the driven profit company they were, wouldn't even budge the slightest, and constantly complaining players would eventually give up entirely, and move on to other characters, and keqing would then become a relic of the past. This would be keqing's lowest point, as she hit rock bottom in terms of usage, and would then on be never talked about or mentioned until brought up in events or discussions about Rex Lapis. She wouldn't even see the slightest increase in discussion or usage until the arrival of a familiar face. You will often see Kazuha brought up in our videos, and that's because he played a huge role in the turning point of Genshin Impact. I guess we can compare this to Ruame in Honkai Star Rail. Following the release of Kazuha, virtually every character was to receive a pseudo buff, but for keqing, this character was a game changer, and would later prove to provide immense value and for once help formulate a team comp that keqing, for certain, could finally say she was best in. What made keqing amazing with Kazuha was a grouping of elite mobs and elemental damage boosting coupled with the resist shred he provided. Keqing didn't have to chase enemies as much, which allowed her to save more stamina for charge attacks. The resistance shred and elemental damage boost meant that keqing's electro damage had more staying power versus that of physical, absolutely changing the versatility of the character overall for the better, you could say. Bennett, who was a 4-star attack buffer and healer hybrid, was a staple in the team alongside keqing and Kazuha. Now let's take a quick detour. The first banner to release of 2.0 was Ayaka, and funnily enough, this character was everything keqing wanted to be. All of keqing's innate issues were seemingly fixed. In another character, Ayaka could infuse her weapon with cryo with just using a dash. Ayaka could also regain stamina and increase her normal and charge attack damage whenever her dash would hit an enemy. While it did no damage, it would still apply cryo to the enemy, making the swirl much more easier for Anemo users. Lastly, Ayaka had amazing multipliers on her elemental skill and ultimate, proving to be a very strong damage dealer in her arrival. And unlike keqing, she could also give herself an elemental damage boost. Now while keqing essentially got the shorter end of the stick when it comes to the kits, she would receive a massive buff with the release of this character. Ayaka's limited weapon Mist Splitter Reforged would be paired alongside the character, and considering both Ayaka and keqing had near identical kits, they would immensely both benefit from the release of this weapon. Mist Splitter Reforged would give the highest tier base attack of the swords at the time and gave the user up to 44% critical damage at max levels, which would prove to be very valuable for both characters as they both had easy sources of critical rate. Mist Splitter would also give up to 40% elemental damage boost depending on the respective element of the infused weapon the wearer of this limited weapon had. I feel like I could set out an easier way. If you had 2 copies of this weapon, you would essentially put 1 on both of them. And if you had only 1 copy, you would simply just swap depending on what character you were using at the time. Considering keqing's weapon choice wasn't changed even till the time of recording, this would become a tailor-made weapon for the character. keqing's hypercarry team was coming into fruition, and with the arrival of the next Archon, Raiden Shogun would come being the last missing puzzle piece to this perfect team composition. Raiden Shogun felt very similar to keqing. Both characters had roughly the same length when it came to DPS windows in their respective teams. They were both of the same element, and they both had one thing in common: their usage of these same best supports. Alongside this powerhouse came a buffer that was very promising because, as I mentioned, both Raiden Shogun and keqing used these same characters in their hypercarry teams. Kujo Sara releasing alongside Raiden Shogun, though being a premier buffer for the almighty Shogun at the time, she would still have damage buffs that were very valuable for electro damage dealers whom had very short on-field time, due to Kujo Sara's buffs lasting 6 seconds. From what we discussed earlier, this meant one thing for the tsundere cat girl. She would now have another tsundere to join her, completing her best team. The hypercarry keqing team was unlocked really at the 6th constellation, providing massive electro critical damage buffs on top of the general attack buffs that was already given. So it wasn't as if you couldn't use the 2 with another pre-Constellation 6 Kujo Sara. This fully fleshed out hypercarry team alongside the release of Mist Splitter would ultimately give keqing a very comfy spot into the meta, increasing the character's usage. With all things considered of how great these indirect buffs were for the character, she would still be replaced in that electro hypercarry team by Raiden Shogun, who was a newer character and Archon that had tons of more hype and more personal damage in that very same team. So to be quite honest, it isn't a shocker that keqing would remain an underdog at this point, but at the very least, she had a lot more viability compared to where her position used to be in Genshin Impact. Those who would main the character could stand proud, and those who would lose their 50-50 on the Raiden Shogun rated banners at least had a good enough alternative. Post Inazuma, things were looking bright for the character, but there would remain still an issue that would affect not only keqing but also the rest of the Electro cast. The Electro element still had the worst reactions at the time, and many playing realized this, hence why they never even dropped their Vaporize and Melt teams. And even though Raiden Shogun was a strong character in her release, unlike the rest of the Electro cast, she had amazing multipliers and a kit that would allow her to function as a ultimate battery for many teams as well, keqing having no redeeming qualities in her kit to allow her to thrive outside of what was holding her back compared to the best teams in the game, would mean she would still see very little play. Before we do continue on with the video, let's take another quick detour. keqing received a brand new skin in patch 2.4, and to this very day, the skin is highly regarded as being an overall buff to the character, not performance wise of course. I gotta personally say, as someone who used to main this character, it really helped with the contrast of keqing's appearance. I do really enjoy the darker but more glistening crisps of the outfit, and it does help that the hairstyle of the character had also been altered. Hoyo does a really good job when it comes to lance ride patches and the overall in-game festivity. I do understand at the time of you watching this video, Lantern Ride probably left a bitter taste in your mouth, which is completely understandable. 2 years later and only 3 intertwined fates more. Really not cool whatsoever. The Land of Knowledge would not only bring more insight into a shift in the meta, but also brought a brand new element to the game. As mentioned in the previous video on Venti, Dendro was the meta-defining element, and if your character's respective element had a reaction with Dendro, they would receive a buff. One of Dendro's selling points was his interaction with the Electro element, and this would be known as aggravate. On top of all of this, Hoyoverse would also buff the in-game Thundering Fury Electro set to include aggravate as part of its 4-piece damage increasing passive. Elemental skill cooldown reduction, and this would be the biggest buff to every Electro character, essentially, but especially keqing, and here's why. The aggravate elemental reaction is special, because you are rewarded for doing as many multi-hits as you can with the Electro element. keqing has a ton of fast hitting and multi-attacks thanks to her attack string from ultimate, elemental skill, to her normal attack combo. All of keqing's multi-hits in combination with fischl would allow you to consistently proc the aggravate reaction way quicker than any other Electro character. Even alongside Kujo-Sara, one of keqing's best supporters, she would still be able to constantly trigger the additional aggravate damage. Then this is where things started to become a little crazy. The Thundering Fury Electro set would become best in slot for keqing, because her aggravate procs would reduce her elemental skill on cooldown to a point where you would constantly spam it, creating a more fun and engaging playstyle for keqing. While looking a lot more promising thanks to the introduction of Dendro, Genshin Impact will receive, in my opinion, its most broken character to this date. In patch 3.2, Nahida, the 4th Archon to release in Genshin Impact, would bring a lot to the table to give Dendro's its current staying power. Nahida had a lot of Dendro application, the most we've ever seen, making her a staple alongside Electro aggravate damage dealing characters such as keqing. Nahida would also give a ton of free elemental mastery to the on-field character with her ultimate. Considering every reaction would have its final damage boosted by elemental mastery, this would be an even bigger damage boost for keqing's overall damage. Nahida also had her own personal damage to contribute to the team as well, making enemies even quicker to dispose of. All of those benefits, while coupled with having such short field time, long-lasting Dendro application on the enemies, keqing and Electro characters in general would see a huge boost in usage. At this point, keqing mains would have the time of their life, and that's due to keqing having a huge glow up like no other character has ever seen before. These would be the glory days of keqing, and has remained this way ever since the release of Nahida, even carrying over onto the latest region Fontaine. Alhaitham did release in between these two events, and what's interesting about this character is that he's essentially a Dendro's version of keqing. These two characters feel near identical. I thought it was enough of a reason to warrant bringing up Alhaitham in a video centered around keqing. Mihoyo definitely learned from their previous mistake, and made Alhaitham a powerful damage dealer in his debut, but sadly these two characters both want the Little Cabbage Archon on their team. Just like Ayaka and her pairing of Mid-Splitter, keqing could also use Alhaitham's best in slot weapon, Light of Foliar Incision, to the fullest, and that's thanks again to these two having near identical playstyles. As we time skip to current Genshin Impact, Fontaine hasn't changed too much for keqing, really, other than the release of Furina. The 5th Archon, Furina in patch 4.2, was a buff to just about everyone, including keqing. Keqing's buff from Furina's addition to the game was just a better version of Hyper Bloom, not as much of an impact as the addition of Nahida, and definitely not as fun either. With all things considered, keqing is now still an amazing damage dealer thanks to the release of Dendro, but there is one who now stands in the way of all, Neuvillette. This is the most broken damage dealer to ever release in Genshin Impact. I don't know why I always say his name like that. However, the reality situation is that Neuvillette wasn't the character to replace keqing. Although he was the strongest damage dealer in his debut, he still had a different role or played in different teams compared to keqing. The one character to replace keqing completely would release in 4.7, that character being clorinde. Clorinde is everything keqing essentially wants to be as a damage dealer. She has a resettable elemental skill, you can constantly spam it without needing Thundering Fury. She has a very nice multiplier on her ultimate and her basic attack and elemental skill combo, and she works nicely in the aggravate teams, which is pretty much where keqing is best at. Meaning that you are replacing your keqing with your clorinde now, and keqing is now where she was left off in the beginning of Genshin Impact, just an inferior version of other damage dealers, and now even in her own respective element. So there you have it. keqing's journey from rags to riches was definitely something unforeseen. And now we're back to rags again. Because Hoyoverse isn't known to buff or bring existing characters up to par with future releases. Maybe it helped keqing as a leeway character, but who knows. What I do know is that upon writing the script for this video, it was very nice to reflect over the years I have been playing with keqing. From her worst state to her best state, and now in her mid state. I could definitely say I've been there all the way. Thank you for watching and have a nice rest of your day.